My life with Martin Luther King, Jr. The summer of 1964 had been very difficult for my husband, Martin Luther King, Jr. The calls upon him were staggering, and his life was filled with almost incredible pressures. He was away from our home in Atlanta much of the time, involved in the struggle for voter registration, in the movement to integrate public facilities, in a trip to Germany, in the presidential campaign, and in many other difficult and strenuous tasks. Because I was concerned about him, in October soon after he returned from Germany, I encouraged my husband to go to St. Joseph's Hospital in Atlanta for a checkup, hoping that he would, in that way, be able to get a few days' rest. At about 9 o'clock on the morning after Martin went to the hospital, the telephone rang. It rang most of the time in our house. Many of the calls were from people with whom Martin worked, or who wanted to give support to the movement, or who wanted help from him. But many times the telephone brought threats, abuse, and a stream of obscenity. This time when I answered, the voice on the line said, "This is the Associated Press. I would like to speak with Dr. Martin Luther King." I explained that Dr. King was not at home, and the reporter said, "Is this Mrs. King?" When I replied that it was, he said, "We've just received word from Norway that your husband has been given the Nobel Peace Prize for 1964. Of course, I had read in newspaper stories that Martin was being considered for the prize. After that, we heard that he was high on the list of possible winners. But Martin and I both thought these reports were merely rumors, for we thought that the prize was given only to those occupied exclusively in international peace activities. Though Martin had often written and spoken of nonviolence as the salvation of a world in peril, we did not feel others saw the broad implications of his philosophy. "This year the prize is worth $54,000, the reporter said. "What do you suppose Dr. King will do with all that money?" Knowing him, I answered, "I'm sure he will give it all to the freedom movement." "How do you feel about that?" "I think this is where the money should go. I believe in it wholeheartedly." As the reporter hung up, I called Martin at the hospital. When he answered in a sleepy voice, I said gaily, "How is the Nobel Peace Prize winner for 1964 feeling this morning?" "What's that?" Martin asked. "Martin, the Associated Press just called to tell us that the announcement has been made, and you are the winner." After a long silence, Martin said, "I'd better check to see if this is true." Martin told me later that he had fallen asleep after his early morning breakfast at the hospital. When I called him with the news, he was stunned. He thought he was still dreaming. It took me quite a while to analyze my own reactions. Of course, the phone kept ringing, and my first thought was that Martin had checked into the hospital only the day before, and this meant that he would get absolutely no rest because there would be all kinds of people trying to get to him. It seems as if every time he got to the point where he wanted to get away from things, something would happen. On the other hand, I realized that this was exactly the sort of lift Martin desperately needed, and in that moment I was filled with joy. I sat quietly by the telephone and I prayed, "Thank you, our Father. Thank you for what this means to Martin and to the children and to me. Thank you, and help us to be worthy of this blessing." News of the announcement of the prize spread rapidly. Martin was visited by Archbishop Hallinan of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Atlanta. Bishop Hallinan offered his congratulations and then said to Martin, "May I give you my blessing?" Martin said, "Of course," and the Archbishop recited a traditional blessing and made a sign of the cross. Martin responded. Then, to his surprise, the Archbishop sank to his knees beside the bed and quietly said, "May I receive your blessing?" Later, Martin told me how humbled he felt, and how beautiful it was that a Roman Catholic archbishop would receive the blessing of a Baptist preacher named Martin Luther. Of course, I was pleased, but at the same time I was pondering why. Why was Martin's contribution considered of international importance? What was the deeper meaning of all this, some meaning that we were not yet able to understand? But this was not just a prize for civil rights, but for contributing to world peace. Though we were very happy, both Martin and I realized the tremendous responsibility that this placed on him. This was, of course, the greatest recognition that had come to him, but we both knew that to accomplish what the prize really implied, we still had a long way to go. It was a great tribute, but an even more awesome burden. I felt pride and joy, and pain, too, when I thought of the added responsibilities my husband must bear. And it was my burden, too. I think he put it best for both of us when he later said in his acceptance speech, "I feel as though this prize has been given to me for something that really has not yet been achieved. It is a commission to go out and work even harder for the things in which we believe." Later still, when we were in Oslo, Daddy King began to talk about his emotions. "I want to say something to all of you now," he began, "and I want you to listen." He raised his finger to focus our attention in the way he does when he speaks from the pulpit in Ebenezer Church. "I want to try to tell you how I feel. I guess most of you know this, but I just have to say it now anyway." He stopped to draw a deep breath and let it out slowly, as he does when he is gathering his thoughts. "I came from nowhere. My father was a sharecropper, and I didn't have the opportunity to get much formal training when I was growing up. It wasn't until I left the farm and went to Atlanta that I was able to get any real education. I was a man when I finished college, a grown man with my wife and 3 children. I wanted my children to have all the things I had not had. I prayed for the Lord to let them do the things I could not do. This young man here became a minister, and I wanted him to have the best training available, so he was able to get his Ph.D. Then Daddy King talked about the struggle over the years and how difficult it had been for him and Mama King to live with the knowledge that what Martin was doing was so dangerous. He talked of the threats they had been subjected to, the 2 of them. He said, "You don't know how it feels when some stranger calls you on the phone and tells you that he wants to kill you or kill your son." By now, we were all crying. And Daddy King, standing there so big and kind, not bitter at all, said, "I have to talk about this, because even though I feel so proud tonight about what is happening here in Oslo, I must also be humble. I don't want to get puffed up with pride. I'm not that kind of person. So I have to continue to pray so that the Lord will keep me humble. The devil is busy out there, and we have to pray that God will keep my son safe." We were crying because we had all come such a long way. The ceremony was held in Aula of Oslo University. When the speech was over, Dr. Jan presented Martin with a prize, a gold medal and the scroll. Then Martin stepped up to the rostrum to make his acceptance speech. After paying the preliminary courtesies, Martin said, "I am mindful that only yesterday in Birmingham, Alabama, our children, crying out for brotherhood, were answered with fire hoses, snarling dogs, and even death. I'm mindful that only yesterday in Philadelphia, Mississippi, young people seeking to secure the right to vote were brutalized and murdered. Therefore, I must ask why this prize is awarded to a movement which is beleaguered and committed to unrelenting struggle, to a movement which has not won the very peace and brotherhood which is the essence of the Nobel Prize. After contemplation, I conclude that this award, which I receive on behalf of the movement, is a profound recognition that nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and racial questions of our time, the need for man to overcome oppression without resorting to violence. I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in mankind. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life which surrounds him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daylight of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. As I sat listening to Martin, I tried to remind myself of Daddy King's words about humility. Yet I could not help myself. I was proud of Martin and of what he stood for. I was proud that his work and that of his associates had made better the lives of so many of our countrymen. I was proud that black people all over the world had felt renewed courage and hope because of this man, my husband. Forgive me, Lord, I prayed silently. Forgive me if I'm filled with pride, but that's how I feel. I'm so proud of Martin and what he has tried to do that I am worse than puffed up. I feel as if I might burst. Lord, have mercy. While we were in Oslo, we spoke of the long road we had come, but no one who had not traveled it could possibly envision how very long it was. Martin and I both had a heritage deeply rooted in Southern soil. I had grown up in the rural South while he was a product of the urban South. Consequently, our backgrounds were dissimilar. I was born in a modest house on my grandfather's farm, 12 miles out in the county from Marion, Alabama. My father, Obadiah Scott, whom everybody calls Obie, built the house in 1920, the year he and my mother, Bernice McMurray Scott, married. My father is an unusual person, as you had to be to get anywhere at all in those days if you were black. A born leader, he was a good combination of both his parents. I often wonder how he and Daddy King ever made it, for all the cards were stacked against them. They were both born at the beginning of the century, which, in the South, was the very worst period of the repression of the Negro since the days of slavery. After the Civil War, when the Negroes were made free by the Emancipation Proclamation, and given the vote and legal equality by the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, things were better for a while. Black people did vote, and they enjoyed a certain amount of freedom. Then the federal occupation troops were pulled out, and the white Southerners began the process of eroding Negro rights. They were a little careful at first, but in the 1880s and 1890s, with very conservative Republican federal governments in office, the local governments really clamped down. It was then that several of the southern states put the grandfather clauses in their constitutions. Under these rulings, no one was eligible to vote unless his grandfather had been a voter. Of course, most of our grandfathers had been slaves, so that effectively disfranchised almost the entire population. Another device to keep blacks from voting was the high poll tax. It cost $2 to vote in Alabama, but if you were, for example, 30 years old the first time you voted, You had to pay all the back taxes from the time you were 21. In this case, $20. A large part of the annual income of many people at that time. This trick was almost as effective as the grandfather clauses, because very few black people could afford to pay that much to vote. In 1940, in Marion and the surrounding countryside where we lived, there were about 1,000 whites and 2,000 Negroes. But even as late as 1955, only about 150 black people were registered to vote. And that was not the worst of it. After the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of the Supreme Court in 1896 legalizing segregation, or separate but equal facilities, the Jim Crow laws passed by the white legislatures went to horrible and ridiculous lengths. They made it illegal for blacks and whites to eat together in public, to sit together in theaters, buses, or trains, to use the same comfort stations or water fountains, even to enter public buildings by the same door. It was as though the blacks had some contagious disease. And yet, we worked in their houses, prepared their food, nursed their children, and were intimately associated with them in every domestic way. The whole idea was to impress upon the black people that we were an inferior race, to reduce us not to slavery again, but to being less than men. Negroes, no matter what their positions or how much education they had, were never called Mr. or any other title. They were addressed as boy or girl, even if they were old and gray. They were supposed to say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, even to teenage whites. It was all deliberately aimed at instilling the slave mentality in our people. Unhappily, the whites succeeded all too frequently for many years. How sad it made me feel to see some of our people who had been so badly treated. When they spoke to a white person, their backbones seemed to crumple. They seemed diminished. After we became involved in the movement, Martin would say to his oppressed brothers and sisters, "We can straighten up our backs and walk erect now. We are walking to freedom and dignity." During those early years, any Negro who stood up like a man was considered uppity if he went too far, or even if he merely tried to assert his legal rights, he was in grave danger of disappearing. The authorities never investigated. A black man's life was worthless. Of course, in any direct clash or an accusation by a white woman against him, the Negro man was almost invariably lynched. One of my great-uncles was lynched. A kindly white woman came and told his wife what had happened. When she went out looking, she found his body hanging from a tree. After they had strung him up, the lynch mob must have used him for a target practice. His body was full of bullet holes. The system of slavery and consequent segregation as practiced in the United States is the most vicious and evil sin against humanity anywhere. It created within the white man a false sense of superiority, while instilling in the black man a false sense of inferiority. Racism, as we define it today, is deeply rooted in these inhuman practices. It is a wonder that my own father did not end up in a swamp because of his obvious self-respect. His additional and unforgivable crime was that he worked too hard and he got ahead of some of the poor whites. He was the only Negro who owned a truck. This brought him into competition with the whites, and they resented him. Sometimes they would stop him on a lonely road and curse him and threaten to kill him. And there was always a good chance they might do it. He was not a big man, only 5'7", but he had a lot of courage. He never ran away, and I'm sure that is why he survived. He would stand up to them quietly and respectfully. My father used to say, "If you look a white man in the eye, he can't hurt you." Daddy knew it was dangerous. After receiving so many open threats, he bought a pistol and carried it in the glove compartment of his truck. But I don't think he would have shot anyone. It would have been against all his principles. Many times during these years when he left home to go into the deep woods to haul lumber, he'd say to Mother, "I may not get back." I learned very early to live with fear for the people I loved. It was good training, for I have lived that way most of my life. My father, in his bravery and his refusal to be beaten down, is very much the same kind of man my husband was. Even before my sister and I started school, my parents began to instill in us a desire for education. We had a few books in our home which we read and reread. Among the ones which I remember, Mother used to read stories to us about Rumpelstiltskin and the Little Match Girl. We learned Mary Had a Little Lamb, Humpty Dumpty, and other nursery rhymes. Mother had only a fourth-grade education, which she got going to school 3 months a year, minding cows and working in the fields the rest of the time. She married when she was 16 and began to have children. She used to say, "I never was a child. I've been a woman all my life." When I first remember her, she must have been still in her early 20s. When she did her hair in braids, she looked like an Indian. Unlike my father, who is open-hearted and open-handed, my mother is reserved and cautious with strangers, especially white people. "You can't trust any of them," she said, though she does have white friends now whom she likes. But once she accepted you as a friend, she opened her heart. Despite her lack of education, she had a good mind and had a lot of practical wisdom and understanding of life. She seemed more resentful of the injustice done Negroes than my father, who says that people are bad because conditions make them that way. He chooses to think the best about people. My parents realized how much they had missed by not going through school, and my mother was determined that her children would get an education. Despite efforts by Negro parents to protect their children from the dreadful hurt of segregation and discrimination, sooner or later all Negro children lose their racial innocence. Some incident suddenly makes them realize that they are regarded as inferior. White children may suddenly refuse to play with them, or they find out that they have to sit on the hard wooden seats in the hot, crowded balcony at the movies, as we did, instead of in the comfortable orchestra. Then I always smile a little when I hear white people talking nostalgically about the corner drugstore. I remember when I was a very little girl, having to go to the side door of the white-owned drugstore with the other Negro children to buy an ice cream cone. I would have to wait until all the white children were served, and then, no matter what flavor I asked for, the man would give me whatever he had too much of. Of course, we paid exactly what the white kids paid. Black children realize very early that there are places that they cannot go. When that time comes, they go to their mothers and ask, "Why?" Every Negro mother says, "You are just as good as anyone else. It's just the way things are." With his deep hurt, the child realizes that his mother's trying to explain without explaining, and that she wouldn't have to tell him that if there weren't some problem. And it is hard for a child to believe when everything is rigged to prove it is not so. When I went to my own mother with this eternal question of black children, she too said, "You are just as good as anyone else." And then she said very forcefully, "You get an education and try to be somebody. Then you won't have to be kicked around by anybody, and you won't have to depend on anyone for your livelihood, not even on a man." My parents taught us to think of education as the first step on the way to freedom. This was particularly true when I was growing up. Mother said to me, "You want clothes and other things now, But once you have an education, if you still want these things, you can get them. The most important thing now is to get an education. Now I shall speak of things about Martin. When I got home to my room after my first meeting with Martin, my intellect hoped that he had not really meant what he had said about marriage. For I did not want anything to stop me, to stop my career, and my emotions told me that this might. I was not a young girl. I had thought myself in love before, but things did not work out, and I had resolved not to become emotionally entangled again until I was absolutely certain the next man I give my photograph to is going to be my husband, is the way I put it to myself. With Martin, I had all my defenses up, but in my heart I knew they were not too strong. I did not know what to think about him. He seemed so serious, so deeply sincere in what he said. I argued with myself that men always flattered you and pretended to be in love when they were just playing a game. But even though I had the feeling that the career I had wanted and worked for so hard might be jeopardized, I had no intention of not seeing him again. I rationalized it by telling myself that he was such a fine young man that I would wait and see what happened. Martin telephoned me the next day and suggested that we meet Saturday night. I explained that friends of mine were giving a party in Watertown, Massachusetts, on Saturday night, but the young man who was supposed to escort me was uncertain whether he could make it. If he could not, I told Martin he could join us. Martin was willing to wait and see. I noticed that. We drove to the party in Martin's car. On the way, we went by the New England Conservatory to see Mary Powell. Martin said to her, "Mary, I owe you $1,000 for introducing me to this girl." Though I was still resistant intellectually, that was very nice to hear. Our arrival at the party caused quite a stir among the other girls. They said to him, "Oh, so you are M.L. King, Jr. Oh, we've heard so much about you." Martin seemed pleased at the attention they gave him, but I suspect it was because he wanted to impress me. He was always very popular with the girls and was completely relaxed and free and unself-conscious. He explained his popularity by saying, "You know, women are hero worshippers." There's no question in my mind that he was the most eligible young black man in the Boston area at that time. He had taken me to the party, and I was his girlfriend. He treated me with respect and consideration, but he was thoroughly enjoying his success, the swooning and all that. I was very calm, never letting it appear that it bothered me at all, because, of course, I had no claim on him. I never said a word, just observed, and I could not help being affected. That same night when he brought me home, I could see things moving closer and closer. From that day forward, Martin pursued me. Not that I ran very hard. We had wonderful times and talks together, some of them quite serious. Martin had a scholarly mind, and as he told me about delving into philosophy, I realized the depth and breadth of his learning. He had studied the great German philosophers, among them Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche. He was influenced by Hegel and hated Nietzsche, whose will to power almost brought Martin to despair of his hope of influencing the world through the power of love, though it served as an antidote for Hegel's easy idealism. Of the more modern thinkers, Reinhold Niebuhr interested him, and Walter Rauschenbusch's Christianity and the Social Crisis left an indelible impression on his mind, though Martin thought him a victim of the 19th century cult of inevitable progress. Martin had, of course, read Karl Marx, who, he said, had convinced him that neither Marxism nor traditional capitalism held the whole truth, but each a partial truth. "I could never be a communist," he said. "My father is a thoroughgoing capitalist, but I could not be that either. I think a society based on making all the money you can and ignoring people's needs is wrong. I don't want to own a lot of things." At the same time, Martin, even in those days, would say, "I don't want a wife I can't communicate with." From the beginning, he would encourage me to be active outside of the home and would be very pleased when I had ideas of my own and even when I could fill in for him. Yet, it was the female role he was most anxious for me to play. There were also other considerations he had thought about. He would say, "I must have a wife who will be as dedicated as I am. I will be the pastor of a large Negro church in the South. That's where I plan to live and work. I want the kind of wife who will fit into that kind of situation. Can you adjust yourself to Aunt Jane?" By Aunt Jane, Martin meant the good but uneducated parishioner who does not know the difference between you does and you don't. He always had a strong love for the people and a very strong sympathy for the underdog, for the masses, as he would have said, "Of course, I have grown up among women like Aunt Jane and had no qualms about adjusting to them. For I felt that no matter how far I had gone and might go, I would never forget my origins or look down upon the kind of people who were my own." I tried to reassure Martin. Martin saw me as a young lady who was studying music with deep cultural appreciation and to whom the aura of Antioch clung. He was concerned that it might have so far removed me from the people that I would not be able to make the necessary adjustment. It is really sometimes difficult for Negroes who have had this kind of experience to go back into an all-black community and find a balance. Inevitably, you adopt the white man's standards, and you unconsciously begin to act as they would expect you to act rather than being yourself. Martin was concerned about me because at that time he did not know of the early struggles I had gone through in order to survive. He did not yet know I was from such a culturally deprived background. I felt that because I had this kind of background and identification with the masses, I would have no problems. I had not forgotten my heritage. And that is how it proved to be. Martin and I never had serious differences of opinion about racial matters or economics, or the difficult and terrible and glorious things that so unexpectedly befell us. Martin and I were married by Daddy King on the lawn of my parents' home on June 18, 1953. On the Sunday after the wedding, Martin preached at Ebenezer, and I joined the Baptist church. I had discussed this before with Daddy King, who said, "If you don't want to be baptized by immersion, it is not necessary in order for you to become a Baptist. As far as I'm concerned, you don't need to be immersed. But since Martin is going to be a pastor, there might be an objection by some of the church people. I think maybe you should do it." At this point, I no longer had any conflict about sprinkling versus immersion, and I was willing to go through with this ritual as a matter of course. At the Sunday evening service after I joined the Baptist church, I dressed in the traditional white baptismal robe, and I was led to the baptismal pool behind the choir loft, where Daddy King stood in the waist-high water. He wore boots and a rubber suit that came to his chest, over which he wore a black robe and long rubber gloves. I walked into the pool to where he stood. Daddy King gently pushed my head under the water in the ceremony of baptism, saying, "I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost." Martin and I already had shared a deeply religious feeling, and this ceremony, in a sense, helped to bring us closer through its symbolic meaning. People often wonder whether the spirit of nonviolence flowed naturally to Martin from his parents and grandparents. Daddy King tells this story about one incident when he was a small boy. One day his mother gave him a pail and told him to fetch some water. He had filled the pail and started back home when a white man stopped him and said, "Hey, boy, give me that water." Daddy King said, "I can't. My mama told me to bring it to her." The white man insisted. "Boy," I said, "give me that pail." Daddy King replied, "I'm not going to do it." The white man pulled him close to him, tore his clothes off, stripped him until he was naked, and beat him. When Daddy King went back and told his mother what happened, the first thing she said was, "You must swear to me that you will not tell your papa about this, because if you tell him, he'll kill that white man." She then picked up a club and went out and beat the man herself. Apparently, the shame of it caused him to say nothing about the incident, and it seemed to blow over. However, in the community, the story got around, and Martin's grandfather, when he heard it, got a gun and went after the white man. At one point, the Kings were driven off the land for a time. They were hunted, and they lived in the woods for weeks until finally the crisis blew over. As you can see, the spirit of nonviolence was not inherited from Martin's family. What is also amazing is how young Martin's father was when he was taught, "You must stand up for your rights." My husband learned about segregation early in his life. Some white children with whom he used to play lived near the King home in Atlanta. When Martin was 6, he went to the Negro elementary school, and his friends went to the white school. That was when their parents decided to draw the color line. Quite suddenly, they told Martin he could not come to play anymore because we are white and you are colored. In tears, he rushed home to his mother. She took him on her lap, and because he was so intelligent, she told him the story of his people. She explained about slavery and how after it was ended, the white people still thought they were superior and kept apart from the Negroes, and how they made the segregation laws so that Negroes would still feel like slaves. She told him that this happened to our people every day of their lives. Mama King ended with the Negro mother's old refrain, "You are just as good as anybody else." When he was a little boy, Martin had many opportunities to see his father in action. Once they went into an empty shoe store and sat down in the front seats. The clerk said politely, "If you'll move to the back, I'll be glad to help you." Daddy King's temper rose. "You will wait on us here, or we won't buy any shoes." "I can't do it," the clerk said. Daddy King took Martin's hand and left the store. As they walked down the street, he rumbled in his deep voice, "I don't care how long I have to live with this thing. I'll never accept it. I'll fight it till I die. Nobody can make a slave out of you if you don't think like a slave." On another occasion, now well known, when Martin was riding in the car with his father, a policeman stopped them and said to Daddy King, "Boy, show me your license." Pointing at Martin, Daddy King said in his powerful voice, "Do you see this child here? He's a boy. I'm a man." Martin said the policeman was so shattered that his hand shook as he wrote out the ticket. By the time he went to college, Martin realized that he had led a far more protected life than most children. The Kings had a wonderful family relationship, and all through his childhood, Martin knew his parents would support him all the way. Whenever he had an assembly recitation to do in school, or was going to sing in the choir, or play football, anything, Mama and Daddy King were sure to be in the audience rooting for him. Daddy King always felt that it was his duty to be present whenever one of his children was doing something special. If he could not go, Mama King would attend. With his growing social consciousness, Martin wanted to learn at first hand what life was like for really underprivileged people, to learn their problems and feel their feelings. He was also anxious to pay some of his expenses on his own rather than always having to call on his father. That year, instead of taking a summer job in one of the white-collar Negro businesses, he chose to do hard manual labor. He worked handling baggage for the Railway Express Agency, and he took another job on the loading platform of the Southern Bed Spring Mattress Company. The job was exhausting for him physically, and Daddy King wanted him to quit, but Martin persevered. In these jobs, he not only became intimately acquainted with his fellow laborers, but he found out what it was like to work under white bosses. The foreman of the Railway Express Agency often addressed the black workers as nigger, and at the mattress company, Martin himself suffered almost daily humiliation. In the summer of 1945, Martin went with several other Morehouse men to work in the tobacco fields of Connecticut. Though it was hardly a glamorous job, my husband would later talk of the exhilarating sense of freedom he felt to be able to eat at any restaurant and to sit in the orchestra at the movies in Connecticut. Then when the train on which he was coming home reached the southern states and he went to have a meal in the dining car, the waiter ushered him to a rear seat and pulled a curtain down in front of him. I felt as though that curtain had dropped on my selfhood, Martin said. Martin was 17 and finishing his junior year at college when he went to his father and told him that he felt the call to the ministry. Concealing his delight behind an air of doubt, Daddy King proposed that Martin should preach a trial sermon before a small congregation in one of the small auditoriums of Ebenezer. But when the word got around that young M.L. was going to preach, so many people came that they had to move into the main sanctuary. The scene has been described to me so many times that I can almost see Martin looking so young and so innocently earnest that it was hard to believe he would have anything worthwhile to say. But as Dr. Mays said later, the boy was mature beyond his years. He spoke as a man who should have had 10 years more experience. He had a balance and maturity and a grasp of life and its problems that exceeded even that. The sermon was a great success. Martin had inherited his father's ability to preach, though he adopted a far more subdued style. His effort to demonstrate his ability with obvious restraint was compensated for by his youthful sincerity. Daddy King was bursting with pride, but he was humbly grateful to God. He tells of how he got down on his knees that night and thanked the Lord for giving him such a son. In 1947, at the age of 18, my husband was ordained and made assistant pastor of Ebenezer Church. Martin was working very hard. In addition to studies and research, he often preached at the churches in and around Boston. He must have been growing into a more powerful speaker all the time because his reputation as a remarkable young man is still remembered in the Boston area. Though he did a large part of his work in the university library, most of the time he was home studying. Because I was so busy, Martin was wonderful about doing the housework. He did all of the heavy cleaning and even the washing. We had a tub in the kitchen where I would put the clothes to soak. Then my husband would wash them when he took a break from his studies. Martin did the best he could, but he generally was unsuccessful. When we put the clothes up on the kitchen lines to dry, though I never told him, they looked like the before on TV commercials. I was very appreciative, but I would wish to myself that he had let me do the job. He would also cook turnip greens, Southern style, with ham hocks and bacon drippings, and of course cornbread, though we cheated on that by buying a mix. As is apparent, we liked soul food. highly seasoned, overcooked, and delicious Southern cooking. Though over the years, as we traveled more, other foods were added to our menu, Martin always loved Southern cooking best. Sometimes you might drop into the pastor's study at Ebenezer, and there would be my husband gnawing at a pig's foot, while the delighted parishioner who had brought him a jar of her specialty sat proudly watching his enjoyment. Dear Martin, he always complained that our cooking was too fattening, yet it was exactly what he loved, and with a plate of greens before him, he never could remember his diet. And though Martin helped so much in the house the first year we were married, all the domestic work did not make him self-conscious. He was too sure of his manhood. One of the difficulties American black men must face is that the whole social system beats down upon them harder than on the women. It is more difficult even now for them to find good jobs than it is for their women. The men are regarded with more suspicion and with more fear by whites. In that period especially, any assertion of black manhood was regarded by the ruling class as dangerous and was quickly put down, sometimes in the South at least, with a rope around the neck. With this background, it has been difficult until very recently for black men to take their natural place as the head of the household and the protector of their families. Where black men have had to turn away from their responsibilities, it has been because of the remorseless pressure of a hostile society, not because of any innate character fault. Martin had none of these inhibitions nor any of the psychological insecurities that seem to beset so many men in white America. He always made me feel like a real woman because he was a real man in every respect. After we were married, he said, "I want my wife to respect me as the head of the family. I am the head of the family." We laughed together at that slightly pompous speech, and he backed down. "Of course, I don't really mean that," he said. "I think marriage should be a shared relationship." In the winter of 1954, Martin had almost completed his residence requirements for his degree and was well into his thesis. He began looking for a pastorate which would not only be personally rewarding, but would give him an opportunity to work toward improving the conditions of the black masses. He had several good offers. 2 northern and 2 southern churches were interested in talking with him. In addition, he was offered a deanship in a small college and teaching jobs in 2 others. Martin and I both would have enjoyed living in an academic atmosphere, but this did not coincide with Martin's commitment to work for his people. Someday, he thought, he would like to teach and preach in a college part-time. As a matter of fact, throughout the years, Martin would occasionally dream out loud about taking a few hours a week to teach in a quiet university where he would have time to think instead of hurtling from one action to another. However, the ministry was his dominant interest, and we had to decide which church position Martin should seriously consider. Here we disagreed. I wanted to go back south someday. It was our home, and we loved it, but not yet. Selfishly, perhaps, I wanted to breathe the freer air and the richer cultural life of the North a while longer, and to enjoy the greater opportunities a northern city would give me for furthering my musical career. But our lives did not permit that luxury. Martin seemed to have the need to get on with his destiny. He felt that he should go south immediately. His intense dedication compelled him toward the harder rather than the easier solution. He had warned me of this long ago during our courtship, and now he said to me, "I'm going back south. I'm going to live in the South because that is where I'm needed." Though Martin's interest was broad enough to include all underprivileged peoples, whatever their race, He most certainly felt that his place was as pastor of a Negro church in the South. He wanted this because it would bring him into closer contact with the people to whom he wanted to devote his life. For several days we thought and talked and prayed over this decision. Eventually I bowed to his wish without any great struggle, for when we married, I knew that where he went, I would go. In January, Martin was invited to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, to preach his initial sermon. Martin had said he was rather nervous about being called to preach there, in spite of the 3 summers of experience at Ebenezer. But he told himself with sensible humor, keep Martin Luther King in the background and God in the foreground, and everything will be all right. Remember, you are a channel of the gospel, not the source. As Martin was being ready to be the leader and the symbol of the Negro movement, so I was being prepared to be his wife and helpmate. It was in Montgomery that I became aware of the contribution I could make in sustaining and helping my husband and what was to come. You could say that the modern movement toward black freedom and equality really began immediately after World War II. For long years, the slow fire of discontent, Martin's phrase, had burned almost unnoticed under the crust of apparent peace imposed by predominantly white society, not just in America, but all over the world. In America, one of the first steps toward racial justice was taken on December the 5th, 1946, when President Harry S. Truman appointed a group of distinguished citizens as members of the President's Committee on Civil Rights. The next big breakthrough in the United States came on May 17, 1954. Martin was working on his doctoral thesis in Boston when the Supreme Court reversed its ancient opinion that separate but equal educational facilities met the requirements of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. In 1955, the court followed this decision with another, ordering public educational facilities in the United States to be desegregated with all deliberate speed, an unfortunate phrase that slowed the process up. From the time he came to Montgomery, Martin followed his commitment to work against all forms of segregation. Of all the facets of segregation in Montgomery, the most degrading were the rules of the Montgomery City bus lines. This northern-owned corporation outdid the South itself. Although 70% of its passengers were black, it treated them like cattle. Worse than that, for nobody insults a cow. The first seats on all buses were reserved for whites. Even if they were unoccupied and the rear seats crowded, Negroes would have to stand at the back in case some whites might get aboard. And if the front seats happened to be occupied and more white people boarded the bus, black people seated in the rear were forced to get up and give them their seats. Furthermore, and I don't think Northerners ever realized this, Negroes had to pay their fares at the front of the bus, get off, and walk to the rear door to board again. Sometimes the bus would drive off without them after they had paid their fare. This would happen to elderly people or pregnant women in bad weather or good, and was considered a great joke by the drivers. Frequently, the white bus drivers abused their passengers, calling them niggers, black cows, or black apes. Imagine what it was like, for example, for a black man to get on a bus with his son and be subjected to such treatment. The fuel that finally made that slow-burning fire blaze up was an almost routine incident. On December 1st, 1955, Mrs. Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress whom my husband aptly described as a charming person with a radiant personality, boarded a bus to go home after a long day working and shopping. The bus was crowded, and Mrs. Parks found a seat at the beginning of the Negro section. At the next stop, more whites got on. The driver ordered Mrs. Parks to give up her seat to a white man who boarded. This meant that she would have to stand all the way home. Mrs. Parks was not in a revolutionary frame of mind. She had not planned to do what she did. Her cup had run over. As she said later, I was just plain tired and my feet hurt. So she sat there, refusing to get up. The driver called a policeman who arrested her and took her to the courthouse. From there, Mrs. Parks called E.D. Nixon, who came down and signed a bail bond for her. Mr. Nixon was a fiery Alabamian. He was a Pullman porter who had been active in A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and in civil rights activities. Suddenly, he also had enough. Suddenly, it seemed, almost every Negro in Montgomery had had enough. It was spontaneous combustion. Phones began ringing all over the Negro section of the city. The Women's Political Council suggested a one-day boycott of the buses as a protest. E.D. Nixon courageously agreed to organize it. The first we knew about it was when Mr. Nixon called my husband early in the morning of Friday, December 2nd. He had already talked to Ralph Abernathy. After describing the incident, Mr. Nixon said, "We have taken this type of thing too long. I feel the time has come to boycott the buses. It's the only way to make the white folks see that we will not take this sort of thing any longer." Our greatest concern was how we were going to reach the 50,000 black people of Montgomery, no matter how hard we worked. The white press, in an outraged expose, spread the word for us in a way that would have been impossible with only our own resources. As it happened, a white woman found one of our leaflets which her Negro maid had left in the kitchen. The irate woman immediately telephoned the newspapers to let the white community know what the blacks were up to. We laughed a lot about this, and Martin later said that we owed them a great debt. On Sunday morning, from their pulpits, almost every Negro minister in town urged people to honor the boycott. Martin came home late Sunday night and began to read the morning paper. The long articles about the proposed boycott accused the NAACP of planning Mrs. Parks on the bus. She had been a volunteer secretary for the Montgomery chapter, and likened the boycott to the tactics of the white citizens' councils. This upset Martin. That awesome conscience of his began to gnaw at him, and he wondered if he were doing the right thing. Alone in his study, he struggled with the question of whether the boycott method was basically unchristian. Certainly it could be used for unethical ends, but as he said, we were using it to give birth to freedom and to urge men to comply with the law of the land. Our concern was not to put the bus company out of business, but to put justice in business. He recalled Thoreau's words, "We can no longer lend our cooperation to an evil system." And he thought, "He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." Later, Martin wrote, "From this moment on, I conceived of our movement as an act of massive non-cooperation. From then on, I rarely used the word boycott." A little after midnight, we finally went to bed, but at 5:30 the next morning we were up and dressed again. The first bus was due at 6 o'clock at the bus stop just outside our house. We had coffee and toast in the kitchen, then went into the living room to watch. Right on time the bus came, headlights blazing through the December darkness, all lit up inside. I shouted, "Martin, Martin, come quickly." He ran in and stood beside me, his face lit with excitement. There was not one person on that usually crowded bus. We stood together waiting for the next bus. It was empty, too, and this was the most heavily traveled line in the whole city. Bus after empty bus paused at the stop and moved on. We were so excited we could hardly speak coherently. Finally, Martin said, "I'm going to take the car and see what's happening other places in the city." He picked up Ralph Abernathy, and they cruised together around the city. Martin told me about it when he got home. Everywhere it was the same. A few white people and maybe one or two blacks in otherwise empty buses. Martin and Ralph saw extraordinary sights, the sidewalks crowded with men and women trudging to work, the students of Alabama State College walking or thumbing rides, taxicabs with people clustered in them. Some of our people rode mules, others went in horse-drawn buggies. But most of them were walking, some making a round trip of as much as 12 miles. Martin later wrote, "As I watched them, I knew that there's nothing more majestic than the determined courage of individuals willing to suffer and sacrifice for their freedom and dignity." The leaders of the movement called a meeting for 3 o'clock in the afternoon to organize the mass meeting to be held that night. Martin was a bit late as he entered the hall. People said to him, "Martin, we've elected you to be our president. Will you accept?" It seems that Rufus A. Lewis, a Montgomery businessman, had proposed Martin, and he had been unanimously elected. The people knew, and Martin knew, that the post was dangerous, for it meant being singled out to become the target of the white people's anger and vengeance. Martin said, "I don't mind. Somebody has to do it, and if you think I can, I will serve." Martin came home at 6 o'clock. He said later that he was nervous about telling me he had accepted the presidency of the protest movement. But he need not have worried, because I sincerely meant what I said when I told him that night, "You know that whatever you do, you have my backing." Reassured, Martin went to his study. He was to make the main speech at the mass meeting that night. It was now 6:30, and this was the way it was usually to be. He had only 20 minutes to prepare what he thought might be the most decisive speech of his life. He said afterward that thinking about the responsibility and the reporters and television cameras, he almost panicked. 5 minutes wasted and only 15 minutes left. At that moment he turned to prayer. He asked God to restore my balance and to be with me in a time when I need your guidance more than ever. How could he make his speech both militant enough to rouse people to action and yet devoid of hate and resentment? He was determined to do both. Martin and Ralph went together to the meeting. When they got within 4 blocks of the Holt Street Baptist Church, there was an enormous traffic jam. 5,000 people stood outside the church listening to loudspeakers and singing hymns. Inside, it was so crowded, Martin told me, the people had to lift Ralph and him above the crowd and pass them from hand to hand over their heads to the platform. The crowd and the singing inspired Martin, and God answered his prayer. Later, Martin said, "That night I understood what the older preachers meant when they said, 'Open your mouth and God will speak for you.'" First the people sang "Onward Christian Soldiers" in a tremendous wave of 5,000 voices. This was followed by a prayer and a reading of the scriptures. Martin was introduced. People applauded. Television lights beat upon him. Without any notes at all, he began to speak. Once again he told the story of Mrs. Parks and rehearsed some of the wrongs black people were suffering. Then he said, "But there comes a time when people get tired. We are here this evening to say to those who have mistreated us so long that we are tired of being segregated and humiliated, tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression. The audience cheered wildly, and Martin said, "We have no alternative but to protest. We have been amazingly patient, but we come here tonight to be saved from the patience that makes us patient with anything less than freedom and justice." Having roused the audience for militant action, Martin now set limits upon it. His study of nonviolence and his love of Christ informed his words. He said, "No one must be intimidated to keep them from riding the buses. Our method must be persuasion, not coercion. We will only say to the people, 'Let your conscience be your guide.' Our actions must be guided by the deepest principles of the Christian faith. Once again, we must hear the words of Jesus, 'Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you.' If we fail to do this, our protests will end up as a meaningless drama on the stage of history, and its memory will be shrouded in the ugly garments of shame. We must not become bitter and end up by hating our white brothers. As Booker T. Washington said, 'Let no man pull you so low as to make you hate him.'" Finally, Martin said, "If you will protest courageously, and yet with dignity and Christian love, future historians will say, 'There lived a great people, a black people, who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization.' This is our challenge and our overwhelming responsibility." As Martin finished speaking, the audience rose cheering in exultation. And in that speech, my husband set the keynote and the tempo of the movement he was to lead from Montgomery onward. We knew we were in for a long struggle. The white people were expecting the boycott to collapse on the first rainy day. But Martin realized that the way to avoid this was through skillful organization. The first order of business was to get our people to and from work with as little inconvenience as possible. A motor pool of volunteer drivers was organized and pickup stations selected throughout the city, with dispatches to match passengers and destinations. But with all we could do, thousands of people still had to walk. They walked magnificently and proudly. Somebody asked one old grandmother coming down the street if she was not tired. She answered, "It used to be my soul was tired and my feet's rested. Now my feet's tired, but my soul is rested." Mass meetings were held twice a week at churches in the city to keep morale up. Thousands of people attended them, some arriving hours ahead of time to be sure of getting a seat. Martin kept a firm hand on the orators to preserve the delicate balance between inspiration and rabble-rousing. By now he was consciously emulating the Gandhian technique, and many people outside of the South were beginning to realize that something new was taking place in Montgomery. Black people, on their own, were creating a new instrument of social change. They were building and developing a totally new kind of structure. My husband never allowed the struggle to limit itself solely to the needs of black people. He said, "What we are doing is not only for the black man, but for the white man too. The system that has banished personality and scarred the soul of the Negro has also damaged the white man's personality, given him a false sense of superiority as it gives the Negro a false sense of inferiority. Segregation is as bad for one as for the other. So in freeing the Negro, we will also free the white man of his misconceptions and his subconscious feeling of guilt toward those he wrongs." One night in January, recalling that I had not wanted to come to Montgomery, I said, Oh, Martin, how happy I am to be living in Montgomery with you at this moment in history. But we could not hold that high note all the time. The threats and the real dangers sometimes were very depressing. One night at a mass meeting, Martin found himself saying without premeditation, "If one day you find me sprawled and dead, I do not want you to retaliate with a single act of violence. I urge you to continue protesting with the same dignity and discipline you have shown so far." On another day, Martin came home feeling very weary. He said later that he had looked at me and the baby and thought they might be taken from me or I from them any time. Then in the middle of the night the telephone rang. An angry voice said, "Listen, nigger, we've taken all we want from you. Before next week you'll be sorry you ever came to Montgomery." It was just another of the abusive calls. But Martin felt he could take no more. He went into the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee and began to think calmly of the position we were in and what the alternatives were. With his head in his hands, Martin bowed over the table and prayed aloud to God, saying, "Lord, I'm taking a stand for what I believe is right. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they will falter. I'm at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone." Martin said to me, "At that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I have never experienced him before. It seems as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, 'Stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever.'" Martin said that after this experience, he rose up sure of himself again, ready to face anything. When it became obvious that the boycott was not going to collapse, the city government decided on a get-tough policy. On one of those dreary January afternoons, Martin told me, "You know, someone told me that the police are planning to arrest me on some trumped-up charge." "That would be a good thing," I said. "It would make our people angry and unite them even more. It would be a great mistake, one of the mistakes they will probably make." Martin decided not to try to avoid arrest. He drove downtown to one of the parking lots that was a station for the carpool. Martin picked up 3 passengers and started out. At the edge of the lot, a policeman stopped him and asked to see his license. As Martin was showing it, he heard another policeman say, "It's that damn King fella." When Martin left the lot, the motorcycle cop followed him. Of course, he drove very carefully, observing all traffic rules. As he stopped to let his passengers out, the policeman pulled alongside and said, "Get out, King. You're under arrest for going 30 in a 25-mile zone." A patrol car pulled up and took Martin to the city jail. He was thrown into a dingy and odorous segregated cell. The first person to reach the jail was Ralph Abernathy. When he offered to post bail for Martin, the official in charge said, "You'll have to wait till tomorrow." "I'm the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Montgomery," Ralph said. "Do you mean to tell me I can't sign a bond?" "No, you can't." "Can I see Dr. King?" "No." Pretty soon the deacons of the church and many other people began gathering at the jail. It must have looked ominous to the police. Nervously, the jailer hauled Martin out of his cell to a chorus from its inmates. "Don't forget us, Dr. King." Martin was fingerprinted and then was told, "All right, King, you're released on your own recognizance." Martin told me later that he had been a little frightened that first time in jail. He had not even known where the jail was before, and he thought they might be taking him out to lynch him. On Monday, January 30th, 1956, at about 9:30 in the evening, I had put on my robe, and Mary Lucy Williams, our good friend and church member, and I were chatting in the sitting room. I heard a heavy thump on the concrete porch outside. Had I not been anticipating an attack, I might have looked out to see what it was. Instead, I said, "It sounds as if someone has hit the house. We'd better move to the back." We moved fast, not through the hall, which would have taken us nearer to the sound, but straight back through the guest bedroom. We were in the middle of it when there was a thunderous blast. Then smoke and the sound of breaking glass. Mary Lucy grabbed me and started screaming. Her screaming frightened me, and I was shaken by the impact of the noise. I hurried to the bedroom, 2 rooms back, where Yolanda was in her bassinet. She was all right, and I automatically reached for the telephone. Then I thought, whom am I going to call? I'm not going to call the police in this instance. Then the doorbell started ringing. My first thought was that it was the person who had thrown the bomb. I was trying to think of what I should do about the baby, and for a split second I got panicky. Then I shouted, "Who is it?" And a voice said, "Is anybody hurt?" I went to the door and let in my neighbors. They were frightened and worried. All over our part of town, people had heard the blast and came rushing. The windows had been blown into the living room. The floor was covered with broken glass. The porch had been split, and there was a small hole in the concrete floor. All of the lights were off in the front rooms, and I got a light bulb and screwed it into a socket so we could see. Then I decided to call Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church, where the mass meeting was being held and where my husband was speaking. Mrs. Irene Grant, a member of the church whom I knew, answered, and I told her that our house had been bombed. I didn't think about telling her that the baby and I were safe, but I asked her to get some people to the house quickly. My thought was that our friends ought to come for protection. I did not want the police because I could not be sure that they did not know about the bombing before I did. In his account of that terrible night, Martin wrote, "Strangely enough, I accepted the words of the bombing calmly. My religious experience a few nights before had given me the strength to face it." He interrupted the speech to tell the people what had happened, and he urged them all to go straight home. "Don't get panicky and lose your heads," he said. "Let us keep moving with the faith that what we are doing is right, and with the even greater faith that God is with us in the struggle." Then Martin rushed home. The situation outside the house was tense and dangerous. Though the crowd was singing, the people were angry and aroused. I remember hearing "My country 'tis of thee," but you could sense the heat of their anger. Many were armed. Even the little boys had broken bottles. A policeman held back one black man who said, "You got your .38, I got mine, let's shoot it out." Later someone said tension was so high that if a white man had accidentally tripped over a Negro, it could have triggered the most awful riot in our history. The crowd was so wrought up that the white reporters were afraid to leave to file their stories. The faces of Mayor Gale and Commissioner Sellers were deathly pale. They went up to Martin and expressed their regret that this unfortunate incident had taken place in our city. Chairman C.T. Smiley of Dexter's trustee board and principal of Booker T. Washington High School, the largest Negro high school in the city, standing beside Martin, said angrily, "Regrets are all very well, but you are responsible. It is you who created the climate for this." More people were joining the crowd every minute. They stood swaying and muttering and shouting insults at the nervous police. At that point, Martin walked out on the porch. In some ways, it was the most important hour of his life. His own home had just been bombed. His wife and baby could have been killed. This was the first deep test of his Christian principles and his theories of nonviolence. Standing there, very grave and calm, he dominated those furious people. He held up his hand, and they were suddenly silent. The crowd of angry men and women, of excited children and sullen, frightened policemen in a clump by the steps, all were absolutely still. In a calm voice, Martin said, "My wife and my baby are all right. I want you to go home and put down your weapons. We cannot solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with nonviolence. Remember the words of Jesus, 'He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword.'" After that, the crowd began to thin out, and the people went back to their homes. A white policeman's voice was heard in the crowd saying, "If it hadn't been for that nigger preacher, we'd all be dead." Things quieted down for a short time, and in the middle of February, I took Yoki to stay with my family for a few days, and then I went to Mama and Daddy King's in Atlanta. Martin went to Fisk University in Nashville to give a series of lectures. While we were gone, a Montgomery attorney dug up an old state law against boycotts. The Montgomery grand jury was called and brought an indictment against Martin and about 90 other leaders of the movement. The police immediately began to make arrests. The moment he heard this news, Martin canceled the rest of his lectures and came to Atlanta to pick me up and take me back to Montgomery with him. He went back knowing that he would be arrested. Daddy King was absolutely determined that this should not happen. So unafraid for himself, he was in a state of terror for his son. He gathered a group of friends, Atlanta's most eminent black leaders, to reason with Martin. Martin listened intently to everything they had to say, and then he made his position clear. "I must go back to Montgomery," he said. "I would be a coward to stay away. I could not live with myself if I stayed here, hiding while my brothers and sisters were being arrested in Montgomery. I would rather be in jail 10 years than desert my people now. I have begun the struggle, and I can't turn back. I've reached the point of no return." There was dead silence in the room. All those men knew he was right. The silence was broken as Daddy King burst into tears. He too knew that Martin was right. He had surrendered. He said, "Well, son, you know that whatever you decide to do, you can count on Daddy." As soon as we returned to Montgomery, Martin went down to the courthouse with Ralph Abernathy and with Daddy King to surrender himself. The police booked Martin, fingerprinted him, and took a mug shot of him with a number hung on his chest like a criminal. Then he was released on bail. On Thursday, March 22nd, both sides rested their cases. With hardly a pause for consideration, Judge Carter gave the inevitable decision: guilty. He sentenced Martin to pay a fine of $500 or serve 386 days at hard labor. The judge said he was giving Martin a minimum penalty because of what he had done to prevent violence. Many people in the courtroom burst into tears, while others sat with bowed heads. Our lawyers immediately said they would appeal, though they knew it was not much use, and Martin was granted bail. As Martin and I walked out of the courtroom, dozens of friends followed us. Outside there was a great crowd shouting, "God bless you." Then they began to sing, "We ain't gonna ride the buses no more." Our lawyers not only appealed the verdict against Martin, They also started proceedings in the federal district court to have segregation on the buses declared unconstitutional. The case was heard by a 3-judge panel on May 6, 1956. Martin spoke of the great relief it was for us to be in a federal court where there was an atmosphere less restricted by Southern thinking. 2 weeks later, in a 2-to-1 decision, this federal court held that bus segregation was unconstitutional. The city attorneys immediately appealed the case to the United States Supreme Court. This meant that it would be months before there was any decision. At this point, the city fathers thought up the most dangerous of all challenges to us. On October 30th, 1956, Mayor Gale instructed the city's legal department to file such proceedings as it may deem proper to stop the operation of carpools or transportation systems growing out of the boycott. Our lawyers tried to block such a move by asking an injunction in the federal court. They were unsuccessful. A hearing was set for November 13th. Martin and the other leaders were served with subpoenas. As the day approached for the hearing on the carpool injunction, he was apprehensive. He said to me, "You know the people are getting tired. If the city officials get this injunction against the carpools, and they will get it, I'm afraid our people will go back to the buses. It's just too much to ask them to continue if we don't have transportation for them. They will go back." On the night before the hearing, he spoke to a mass meeting, telling the plain truth that an injunction against the carpool would almost certainly be granted. He told the people he did not know if he could ask them to do more. Yet, if they did not, all our months of protest would fail. Then he said, "This may well be the darkest hour before dawn. We have moved all these months with the daring faith that God is with us in our struggle. The many experiences of days gone by have vindicated that faith in a most unexpected manner. We must go on with that same faith. We must believe that a way will be made out of no way." When he came home that night, my heart ached for my husband and for my people. The next morning, November 13th, 1956, we were in court once more before Judge Carter. The Montgomery attorneys told the court that the city had lost $15,000 in taxes as a result of the reduction of bus travel and asked for compensation. They further alleged that the carpool was a public nuisance as well as a private enterprise operating without a license fee or franchise. They asked for an injunction against it. The arguments droned on. We all knew that it was just a matter of form. Judge Carter was going to grant that injunction. Then, at just about noon, there was a sudden stirring. Mayor Gale and Commissioner Sellers abruptly left their seats, followed by 2 of the city attorneys. Several reporters were rushing around. The Associated Press reporter handed Martin a slip of paper, and we were all straining to see. Martin read the note to the people at the table. Then he came running back to me, his face beaming. "Listen to this," he said, and he read aloud. "The United States Supreme Court today affirmed a decision of a special 3-judge United States District Court declaring Alabama's state and local laws requiring segregation on buses unconstitutional." Many of the people heard Martin reading, and the word passed through the courtroom in a moment. Though court was still in session, there was a great humming and half-whispered talk, and people were moving about. One old man shouted out, "God Almighty has spoken from Washington, D.C." The Supreme Court decision was a crucial landmark, but more basic and more heroic was the influence of the long boycott. Without the unprecedented unity and the determined militancy of the black community of Montgomery, the segregationists would have found the means of evasion as they had for the decades past. On December 20th, 1956, the Supreme Court order reached Montgomery. That day, Mayor Gale announced that he would obey the ruling and maintain order. At a mass meeting that night, Martin reviewed the long struggle and said, "Our faith is now vindicated." He announced the official end of the boycott and urged everyone to return to the buses on a non-segregated basis the next day. The next morning at 5:45, a little group gathered in our living room. Mrs. Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy, Edie Nixon, and Glenn Smiley, who was white, came to ride the first desegregated bus with Martin. No one knew what would happen in view of the threats and fury of the white extremists. Reporters and television people waited outside. Like an anniversary of that memorable morning over a year before, the headlights of the 6 o'clock bus flashed down the empty street as it pulled up at the bus stop. The men walked down the steps of our house and through the front door of the bus. The bus driver, smiling broadly, said in almost a parody of the explorer Stanley's famous remark to Dr. Livingston, "I believe you are Dr. King." Martin said, "Yes, I am." "We're glad to have you with us this morning," the driver said. Smiling too, his tenseness gone, Martin thanked him and sat down in a front seat beside Glenn Smiley, the white man. With a clash of gears and a puff of exhaust, the first bus pulled away as though nothing had happened. Martin rode different bus lines most of that day. At his suggestion, other ministers did the same, to be on hand in case of trouble. There was no real disturbance at first, only a few minor instances of rude behavior of whites to blacks. However, it was too good to last. Fury and frustration built up among a few extremist racists. Some nights buses were stoned and shots were even fired into them. Negroes were dragged off the buses and beaten up. One pregnant woman was shot in the leg. People were taunted and abused. One night, someone fired a small caliber rifle through our front door. Then, on a night in January, there was a concerted guerrilla attack. Ralph Abernathy's house and his church were dynamited. Bob Gretz's home was bombed. 3 other Negro churches were bombed, 2 of them completely destroyed. Martin was deeply affected. On his 28th birthday, Monday night, January 15th, 1957, he spoke at a mass meeting. He pleaded with his followers to receive the violence and to meet it with love. He said that only through love could we survive. After leading the audience in prayer, he intoned, "Oh Lord, I hope no one will have to die as a result of our struggle for freedom in Montgomery. Certainly I don't want to die. But if anyone has to die, let it be me." The audience was in an uproar, shouting, "No, no!" Martin stood in the pulpit, moved by the response, and then went quietly to his seat. Montgomery was the soil in which the seed of a new theory of social action took root. Black people had found in nonviolent direct action a militant method that avoided violence, but achieved dramatic confrontation, which electrified and educated the whole nation. It identified the evil, it clarified the wrongs. It summoned the latent strength of the oppressed and provided a means to express their determination. Without hatred or abjectly bending their knees, the demand for freedom emerged in strength and dignity. Black people had been waiting for this, and instinctively they seized the new method and opened a new era of social change. Our victory in Montgomery showed the South what could be accomplished by a united effort carried out in a legal, nonviolent way. My husband had become a hero to black people all over the United States. They had long been looking for a genuine and creative leader, and now they turned to Martin. He was conscious of this tremendous responsibility. On September 3rd, 1958, Martin and I went to the courthouse in Montgomery where Ralph Abernathy was to testify in a private case. We were standing in a group just outside the recorder's courtroom when a policeman ordered us to move on. Martin said, "I'm waiting to see my lawyer." The policeman said, "If you don't get the hell out of here, you're gonna need a lawyer." Martin stood his ground. The officer said, "Boy, you done it now." He called another policeman, and together they grabbed Martin, twisted his arms behind him, and pushed him down the stairs toward the city hall. He was kicked and roughed up, and then when they discovered who he was charged with disobeying an officer and released on his own recognizance. When he got back, we had a long talk. Martin knew he would be convicted and fined, but he said to me, "The time has come when I should no longer accept bail. If I commit a crime in the name of civil rights, I will go to jail and serve the time." He asked what I thought, since I would be affected more than anybody else. I assured him that I agreed with him that the time had come for someone to take this risk, and that he was the best person to do so. Martin was responding to the influence of Gandhi and his techniques of non-cooperation. But my husband was becoming firmly convinced that the black leadership must prepare to suffer as Gandhi had. He did not want to go to jail. It was a terrible prospect for a man as sensitive and fastidious as he. We both knew the terrors of Southern jails, that over the years many Negroes who had been in prison even for short sentences simply disappeared. However, Martin realized that his imprisonment would arouse sympathy for our movement. He felt that if he asked other people to suffer in the cause, then he, their leader, should be prepared to do so in still greater measure. He said, "You see, this is not the life I expected to lead, but gradually you take some responsibility, then a little more, until finally you are not in control anymore. You have to give yourself entirely. Then once you make up your mind that you are giving yourself, then you are prepared to do anything that serves the cause and advances the movement. I have reached that point. I have no option anymore about what I will do. I have given myself fully." As we had foreseen, my husband was found guilty and sentenced to a fine of $10 or 14 days in jail. He chose to go to jail. Martin's actions caught the judge by surprise. He appeared startled. He said to Martin, "Dr. King, you know you can get out on bail. Wouldn't you like to get someone to pay your fine?" "No, Your Honor," my husband answered. "I do not wish to pay the fine." When the time came for the prisoners who had been sentenced to be taken to jail, Martin followed at the end of the line. When it came Martin's turn to enter the wagon, the prison officials refused to let him in. He went inside again and waited for the second load. The same thing happened all over again. By this time, Martin realized that there was a design to keep him out of jail. The authorities seemed baffled as to how to proceed, but Martin was determined to serve his time. Finally, he was told, "Dr. King, you may go now. Someone has paid your fine." Greatly puzzled, Martin said, "I wonder who it could have been." "It was probably one of your associates," he was told. Martin insisted that this could not be because he had informed his associates of his plans and instructed them not to pay his fine. Martin was persistent in trying to find out how his fine got paid, and finally he was told that an anonymous person had paid his fine. He had no alternative but to leave. Police Commissioner Clyde Sellers had a keener sense of public relations than his subordinates. He realized what bad publicity Montgomery and its public officials would get when the nation learned that Martin Luther King Jr. was in their jail. He paid the fine out of his own pocket and issued a statement that he wanted to save the taxpayers the expense of feeding King for 14 days.
"1960 was the year of the student sit-ins to desegregate lunch counters and restaurants. They began in Greensboro, North Carolina, when Joseph McNeil, a freshman at the Agricultural and Technical College of North Carolina, was refused service at the bus terminal lunch counter. His roommate, S.L. Blair, Jr., showed him a book that had been published about Martin and the bus boycott. Inspired by this, Blair, McNeil, and two other freshmen went to Woolworth's 5 and 10 on February 1st and sat there, quietly but insistently demanding service. Of course, they were refused, but they also refused to leave. Day after day, they went back and sat, joined by both black and white students coming from the Women's College of the University of North Carolina and Bennett College. The wire services picked up the story, and the movement spread like a forest fire. Within 2 weeks, black and white students in college towns south from Virginia to Florida and west to Louisiana organized sit-ins. Some were arrested, but this merely spread the flames. It was during these demonstrations that the song which was to become the anthem or symbol of the movement was first sung. It is based on a Negro church hymn which was first sung by black textile workers. During the 1940s, it was brought to Tennessee and later taken up by the students, and then by all of us. People sang it at one rally after another, until finally no rally could end without it. "We Shall Overcome," with new verses added all the time, was sung at sit-ins and by marchers, by demonstrators facing police dogs and fire hoses, in churches and paddy wagons, and in jailhouses throughout the South. It was so spirited and carried so much resolve and emotion that it gave people courage and determination. It became our anthem, the Marseillaise of the movement. It is difficult to describe how inescapably segregation pursued you, even though you instinctively tried to avoid putting yourself into situations where you would be insulted. Martin was once on a trip flying into Atlanta, well after he had achieved national recognition. He struck up a conversation with a white man sitting beside him on the plane, and they enjoyed their conversation together so much that his fellow passenger invited Martin to have lunch with him at the airport when they landed in Atlanta. Martin gladly accepted, and the two men went into the restaurant together. They asked for a table for two, and the hostess looked at Martin and said, "I'll have to seat you at a separate table." She directed Martin to an area behind a curtain and said, "Everything is the same. The food, the table, and the chairs are the same." My husband answered her kindly but firmly, "Oh, no, it is not the same. When you segregate me, you deprive me of fellowship with my brother here when I want to continue to talk to him." He pointed to the decorated walls and said, "When I'm behind this curtain, you deprive me of the aesthetic pleasure of those paintings. It's not all the same." Of course, Martin was not willing to be seated behind a curtain, and he left. It was against just such discrimination that the students began to organize protest demonstrations. Their main target in Atlanta was Rich's department store, one of the largest in the South. They invited Martin to sit in at the lunch counter with them, and of course, he accepted with alacrity. There were about 75 students in the group on that particular day, and they were all arrested, Martin with them. It had been agreed in advance that if they were arrested, they would not put up bail, and most of them stayed in jail. Martin said, "I'll stay in jail 1 year or 10 years, if it takes that long to desegregate riches." By this time, Yoki and Marty were almost 5 and 3 respectively. This was to be the first time they were aware of his going to jail. They had heard the news on the radio as they were being driven home from nursery school. Yoki came home crying, and both of them asked me, "Why did Daddy go to jail?" I had been trying to prepare myself for this day, and now I said to them, "Your daddy is a brave and kind man. He went to jail to help people. Some people don't have enough to eat, nor do they have comfortable homes in which to live, or enough clothing to wear. Daddy went to jail to make it possible for all people to have these things. Don't worry, your daddy will be coming back." Later, he went to jail in Albany in early December of 1961. The children were a year older, 6 and 4, when the news reached us by television. Yoki again cried because she feared her daddy would not be back for Christmas. This time, Marty consoled her. It was a deeply touching experience for me. Only 4 years old then, he sat on the side of the bed with one leg folded under the other, which hung off the side of the bed. He said, "Don't cry, Yoki. Daddy will be back. He has to help the people. He's already helped some people, but he has to help some more, and when he finishes, he'll be back. So don't cry, Yoki." One day news spread through Atlanta that a settlement had been reached and that Martin and the students were going to be released. Then someone told me they had kept Dr. King in jail. Finally, I discovered what had happened. Back in April or May, Martin, who had neglected to change his Alabama driving license for one from Georgia, had been arrested for driving with an invalid license. It had happened one night when we had dinner and spent the evening with Lillian Smith, the eminent writer. Afterwards, we took her back to Emory University Hospital. On the way, a policeman stopped Martin simply because he had a white woman in the car. Then, when he saw that he was dealing with that well-known troublemaker, he issued a summons. This had happened in nearby DeKalb County, a well-known stronghold of the Klan. The next day, Martin and Daddy King went to answer the summons. Martin had been fined $25, given a suspended sentence, and released on probation. Somehow he was not aware at the time of the suspended sentence. Now, when he was being released on the sit-in charges in Atlanta, DeKalb County officials came and asked for his custody on the grounds that he had violated his probation by the sit-in. This was Saturday night. A hearing was set for Tuesday, and Martin stayed in jail. On Tuesday morning, the DeKalb County Sheriff came to the cell for him. He handcuffed Martin and walked arrogantly out with his prisoner. Naturally, the press photographers were alert. A picture of Martin handcuffed following behind the sheriff appeared in newspapers throughout the country. I went to the hearing at the DeKalb County Courthouse with Daddy King, Christine, and A.D. At the end of the proceedings, Judge Mitchell said, "I find the defendant guilty and sentence him to 6 months hard labor in the state penitentiary at Reedsville." It was a horrible shock to all of us. Obviously, a viciously unjust sentence for a traffic violation. It was hard to bear. I was 5 months pregnant and emotionally overwrought. Martin was immediately taken back to the jail cell. Daddy King and I were allowed to go to see him. I was trying not to cry when he went into the cell, but the tears were streaming down my face. When Martin saw me, he said, "Corey, dear, you have to be strong. I've never seen you like this before. You have to be strong for me." Then I realized that Martin had been weakened by his days in jail and was greatly depressed by this unexpected shock. He was relying on the deep reservoir of strength which I had always drawn from in crisis situations. But I, too, was totally unprepared for the dreadful decision. Daddy King said, "You don't see me crying. I'm ready to fight. When you see Daddy crying, Coretta, then you can start crying. I'm not taking this lying down." So he said, but he was emotionally affected. Later, Martin told me that at 4:30 the following morning, several men had come into the jail cell where he was sleeping with the other prisoners. They played a flashlight on his face and called, "King! King! Wake up!" It was frightening. Again, he knew only the awful history of such midnight visits, and nothing of where they were taking him. They made him dress and handcuffed him very tightly and put chains around his legs. He rode the 300 miles to Reidsville in those painful handcuffs and chains without knowing what his fate would be. When he got to Reidsville, exhausted and humiliated, he was thrown into a very narrow cell where hardened criminals were kept, and then made to put on a prison uniform. The next day, the telephone rang. The person at the other end said, "May I speak to Mrs. Martin Luther King, Jr.?" "Just a minute, Mrs. King, for Senator Kennedy." Senator John F. Kennedy was in the final days of his campaign for President of the United States. I waited a few seconds, and a voice made familiar by scores of television broadcasts said, "Good morning, Mrs. King. This is Senator Kennedy." We exchanged greetings, and then Senator Kennedy said, "I want to express to you my concern about your husband. I know this must be very hard for you. I understand you are expecting a baby, and I just wanted you to know that I was thinking about you and Dr. King. If there's anything I can do to help, please feel free to call on me." "I certainly appreciate your concern," I said. "I would appreciate anything you could do to help." Well, things began to happen pretty fast after that. I heard that Robert Kennedy called Judge Mitchell to learn why Dr. King couldn't be released on bail pending appeal. That story leaked out to the press, and evidently Judge Mitchell had a change of heart. Now he said Martin would be released on bail. I received the news about Martin's release around noon the next day, and I was very, very happy. A few days later, John Kennedy was elected President of the United States by only about 100,000 votes. It is my belief that historians are right when they say that his intervention in Martin's case won the presidency for him. In January 1963, my husband, Ralph Abernathy, and Fred Shuttlesworth had a conference with President Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy at the White House to urge the federal government to initiate civil rights legislation in 1963. The Kennedys were, as always, sympathetic, but they said they had no plans for proposing any civil rights legislation in 1963. The president said he was going to propose some important domestic legislation, and he feared that anything in the civil rights area would divide the Congress and imperil these bills. Naturally, Martin was very disappointed. He felt he had no choice but to go ahead with his plans to force a confrontation in Birmingham so that the federal government would have to act. He frankly told the president his intentions, because if white violence erupted, we would need the support and help of the federal government. He wanted the president to be informed in advance. The protest started on April 3, 1963, with lunch counter sit-ins. In the first 3 days alone, 35 people were arrested. On Saturday, April 6, an orderly march of carefully selected demonstrators moved toward City Hall. They were stopped 3 blocks from their goal. 42 people were arrested for parading without a permit. They were politely escorted to the paddy wagon and driven to jail. They were singing freedom songs while thousands of Negroes cheered them from the sidewalks. After that, demonstrations were staged every day with increasing strength. Thus far, Bull Connor's police had behaved very well while making the arrests. Between 400 and 500 black people were arrested, and though some got out on bail, about 300 remained in jail. During this time, Martin was trying to get the merchants and the Birmingham city officials to negotiate our very moderate demands: desegregation of store facilities, upgrading and hiring of Negroes on a non-discriminatory basis, dropping of charges against the imprisoned protesters, and creation of a biracial committee to work out a timetable for further desegregation in Birmingham. The businessmen were willing to negotiate at this point. The city officials were not. On Wednesday, these city officials obtained an injunction against the demonstrators, but it was issued by an Alabama state court, not a federal court. Martin promptly announced that the injunction would be disobeyed. He pointed out that the Negroes were not anarchists advocating lawlessness, but that the courts of Alabama had misused the judicial process. He said that we could not in good conscience obey their mandate. As a countermove, the courts announced that bail bonds would no longer be accepted, but that it would be necessary to post cash. As it happened, our organization was fresh out of cash. Martin had set Good Friday, April 12th, for the day that he and some of the other leaders would provoke arrest by breaking the injunction. He had deliberately chosen that day because of its symbolic and religious significance. When I got the news that Martin had been arrested that Friday afternoon, I just knew he would telephone me from jail, which was always the first thing he did after he was arrested. No call came. All the next day, I waited. Then it was Easter Sunday morning. Still, I had heard nothing. In desperation, I telephoned Wyatt Walker in Birmingham. He said, "Coretta, I haven't been able to get a phone message through to Martin. I've tried all day. They're not even allowing his lawyers to see him now. They're holding him incommunicado. I think you ought to call the president." I called the White House several times to see if I could get a number in West Palm Beach where the president was reportedly staying. But each time the operator would say, "I have no number for the president or members of his family at West Palm Beach." I thought, now whom should I call? I told the operator to try Vice President Johnson, but he too was out of the city. Quite frantically, I said, there must be someone I could call who would help me to get to the president. Since she was a kind and sympathetic woman, the operator said, "What about Pierre Salinger?" Immediately I reached Pierre Salinger, who told me that he would make every effort to get in touch with the president and get him to call me. Later the telephone rang, and when I answered, a familiar voice said, "Mrs. King, this is Attorney General Robert Kennedy. I'm returning your call to my brother. The president wasn't able to talk to you because he's with my father, who is quite ill. He wanted me to call you to find out what we can do for you." I poured out a rush of words. I was calling because I'm concerned about my husband. As you probably know, he is in jail in Birmingham, and he's been there since Friday. At this point, no one is able to see him. Usually they let him telephone me, but I have heard nothing from him directly. I understand that he and Reverend Abernathy are being held incommunicado, and I'm awfully worried. I wondered if the president could check into the situation and see if he's all right. I tried to make it clear that I was concerned about Martin's safety and was not asking for his release. I explained that at first they had allowed his lawyer to talk with him, and that it was my understanding that Martin was sleeping on bare steel springs without blankets or a pillow. It was not until the next day, Monday, that I heard anything more. At about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the telephone rang, and as I picked up the receiver, I heard little 2-year-old Dexter babbling away on the extension. The operator said, "Will you get your child off the telephone, please?" I had someone get him off the phone and waited until a voice came on saying, "Hello, Mrs. King. I'm sorry I wasn't able to talk to you yesterday. I understand my brother called you. I just wanted you to know that I was with my father who is ill and couldn't leave him." By that time, I realized it was President Kennedy. He said, "I know you'll be interested in knowing that we sent the FBI into Birmingham last night. We checked on your husband, and he's all right." And the president said, "Of course, Birmingham is a very difficult place." He talked a little while about the situation there and the city officials. Then he added, "I want you to know we're doing everything we can. I've just talked to Birmingham, and your husband will be calling you shortly. If you have any further worries about your husband or about Birmingham in the next few days, I want you to feel free to call me. You can get me or my brother or Mr. Salinger. You know how to get me now." I could hardly thank him enough. What a relief he had brought to my heart. I could hardly wait for the telephone to ring. Within 15 minutes, Martin called. It was almost like a new miracle. "Are you all right, my dear?" I asked. Martin told me he was all right, but he sounded so tired. He usually fasted when he was in jail. There was no energy in his voice. We talked a little before I told him about my phone conversation with the president. There was a sort of smile in Martin's voice as he said, "So that's why everybody's suddenly being so polite. This is good to know." Martin was in jail for 8 days. While in prison, he wrote his famous open letter, a letter from a Birmingham jail, to a group of 8 white Alabama clergymen who had issued a statement calling the protest unwise and untimely, and had criticized Martin as an outside agitator who had come to Birmingham seeking publicity. Martin wrote the letter on the margins of newspapers and scraps of toilet paper. He said, "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here." Then he delved deeply into his whole philosophy of the movement and what he believed the attitude of the Christian churches should be toward it. He wrote that in the same way that one should obey just laws, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And he quoted St. Augustine, saying, "An unjust law is no law at all." On Saturday, April 20th, Ralph Abernathy and Martin were released from jail. That very evening at the Gaston Motel, a leadership conference hit upon the brilliant scheme of enlisting the black school children of Birmingham in the crusade for freedom. Martin realized that he would be severely criticized for using our children in this fashion, but he thought that the time had come to give the movement a dramatic new dimension. In addition, he felt that it was the children who would benefit most from desegregation, that it was the children for whom we were fighting, and that taking part in the movement would give them a sense of worth and dignity and increase their spiritual values. At the same time, everything possible would be done to protect them from physical danger. Andy Young, Bernard Lee, Jim Bevel, and others went recruiting to all the high schools of Birmingham, as well as the Negro colleges. And the children responded by the thousands. They attended mass meetings and training sessions in the philosophy and techniques of nonviolence. Even children too young to march asked for a place in our ranks. Andy Young told them, "You are too young to go to jail. Go to the library. You'll learn something there." 6 small children shyly followed his advice, and all by themselves desegregated the library because no one dared touch them. On D-Day, May 2nd, Martin addressed a group of eager youngsters at the 16th Street Baptist Church. Then they marched downtown singing as they came. They were all arrested. Wave after wave of children marched off singing to suffer the same treatment. 959 young people were arrested that day. We shall overcome. The next morning, Martin announced, "Yesterday was D-Day in Birmingham. Today will be double D-Day." With the spotlight of the nation on him, Bull Connor was becoming desperate. He massed police in the street around the 16th Street Church. As 1,000 children and teenagers marched toward them, he ordered the fire hoses open. Jets of water under 100 pounds of pressure knocked the children flat, ripping the clothes off some of them. Then Connor unleashed the police dogs. They ran wild, biting the children. The youngsters maintained nonviolence, but it was too much for some of our people who watched in agony from the rooftops. They began to throw rocks. Late Sunday afternoon, the late Reverend Charles Billups led a group of adults from the New Pilgrim Baptist Church to the police barricade. They knelt in the street and prayed. Then they walked forward. Bull Connor himself arrived and ordered Reverend Billups to turn back. Billups refused, and his people shouted, "Turn on the water hose, loose the dogs. We ain't going back. Forgive them, O Lord." In a fury, Bull Connor shouted, "Turn on the hoses, damn it." But a miraculous thing happened. As the black people rose from their knees and moved forward, Connor's men, with the hoses sagging in their hands, fell back to each side. The moral pressure of a watching world and the spiritual force of that little band of blacks broke their discipline, disarmed them. Between their ranks, past the leashed dogs, Billups led his people. They held a prayer meeting in a nearby park and marched back to their church singing freedom songs. It was the first crack in the morale of the racist forces. All the next week, the Children's Crusade continued. Birmingham's jails were full. The arrested young people were held in stockades or halls. Finally, there were too many to cope with. As 500 youngsters marched on Tuesday, the police broke up the demonstration but arrested no one. 3,000 people, mostly youngsters, infiltrated past the police by different routes and marched around the downtown streets, in and out of the stores, singing, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, and I'm on my way to Freedom Land." Governor Wallace called out the National Guard. On May 4th, President Kennedy sent Burke Marshall to Birmingham to try to negotiate a settlement. On Friday, May 10th, an agreement was announced. It was almost word for word an acceptance of the original demands of the movement. The stores were to be desegregated, hiring of Negroes upgraded, charges dropped, and the Senior Citizens Committee, or the Chamber of Commerce, would meet regularly with black leaders to reconcile their differences. Birmingham represented a real victory for the movement because the officials of the city and the white merchants sat down with the black leadership and negotiated a settlement. The victory had broad implications. Martin's long-range strategy in going into Birmingham was to focus national attention on the grave injustices endured by Negroes and to bring about federal legislation. My husband had written that Birmingham was the colossus of segregation. A victory there would radiate across the South, cracking the whole edifice of discrimination. And it happened as he had predicted. Within a few months, nearly 1,000 cities were engulfed in the turmoil of change. Except for the Civil War and the Reconstruction, black people had never acted along such a broad front in a direct action drive to alter the conditions of their lives. Nearly 1 million Negroes with their white allies had marched or otherwise demonstrated in the streets of hundreds of cities in that historic summer. By its end, Thousands of public accommodations were wedged open, and a new chapter in race relations was begun. Objectively, exclusion was narrowed. Subjectively, the confidence of Negroes was widened and deepened. This confidence was later to become the foundation for Black pride and slogans of Black power. The fall of Birmingham was a turning point, almost too significant to be grasped at the time of its happening. Politically, as a result of the struggles there, President Kennedy reassessed the position of his administration and decided to propose a civil rights bill in 1963. It was eventually passed by Congress in 1964. At a press conference on the proposed bill at the White House, President Kennedy said to Martin with a wry grin, "Bull Connor has done as much for civil rights as Abraham Lincoln." "1963 was a year of fulfillment and of tragedy for us. First, there was Birmingham with the sense of hope and accomplishment we derived from it. Then, hardly a month later, on June 12th, the young Mississippi NAACP leader Medgar Evers was shot dead in the very door of his home in Jackson. Then, since Martin was greatly troubled by sporadic outbreaks of rioting in some cities, he felt that a great peaceful demonstration in Washington would serve the double purpose of providing the Black masses with a chance for nonviolent protest, and at the same time would put pressure on Congress to pass President Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. The Washington March was set for August 28, 1963. It was to be a short march down the mall from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, where the speeches would be made. The sound of typewriters and voices in the next room awakened me early. I found my husband watching the crowds from the window of our hotel suite. As it approached the time that the march was to begin, we became anxious about how large the turnout would be. The reports on television were very discouraging. "A very small number of people have assembled," they said. Before we left the hotel, they were saying about 25,000. We were subdued and saddened because that was a far cry from the 100,000 we had hoped for. Then when we reached the mall, our spirits soared. The reporters had grossly underestimated the crowd. There were 90,000 assembled by 10 o'clock, and by the time we arrived, that whole vast green concourse was alive with 250,000 people. They had come by plane, train, bus, automobile, some by bicycle, and a few by foot, from all parts of the nation. Almost a fourth of that enormous crowd was white. It was a beautiful sight. The way it worked out has often been told. The leaders did not really lead the great march on Washington because by the time they got lined up, all those tens of thousands of people who had been waiting for hours had assembled themselves and moved in great procession to the Lincoln Memorial. The leaders fell into the line of march with the people. We knew that in addition there were millions watching on television, including President Kennedy and the White House. A. Philip Randolph introduced Martin. He called my husband the moral leader of the nation. 250,000 people applauded thunderously and voiced in a sort of chant, "Martin Luther King." Martin was tremendously moved. I could tell by the line of his back and the sound of his voice. A little husky at first, then going out in a strong and beautifully resonant tone that came when he was inspired to his best. He started out with the written speech, delivering it with great eloquence. His main contention was that, instead of honoring her sacred obligations, America had given the Negro a bad check. We are here today to redeem that check, and we will not accept the idea that there is no money in the Bank of Justice. When he got to the rhythmic part of demanding freedom now, and wanting jobs now. The crowd caught the timing and shouted, "Now," in a cadence. Their response lifted Martin in a surge of emotion to new heights of inspiration. Abandoning his written speech, forgetting time, he spoke from his heart, his voice soaring magnificently out over that great crowd and over to all the world. It seemed to all of us there that day that his words flowed from some higher place through Martin to the weary people before him. Yea, heaven itself opened up, and we all seemed transformed. He said, "I say to you today, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream that is deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even in the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children one day will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountains of despair the stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "Let freedom ring." So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. When we allow freedom to ring from every town and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, great God Almighty, we are free at last." As Martin ended, there was the awed silence that is the greatest tribute an orator can be paid. And then a tremendous crash of sound as 250,000 people shouted in ecstatic accord with his words. The feeling that they had of oneness and unity was complete. They kept on shouting in one thunderous voice, and for that brief moment, the kingdom of God seemed to have come on earth. In the early years when he first preached nonviolence, Martin would be asked the inevitable question put to all men of his belief: "What would you do if someone were attacking your wife?" He would answer then, "I'm not sure, but I hope that I would not respond with violence." Later, as his ideals of nonviolence were tested in fire, he was able to answer more surely, confident out of his terrible experiences, that he would not strike out. Martin was always saddened by the outbreaks of violence, not only because of the death and destruction that resulted, but also because he felt that such events set back the cause of black freedom. He was intensely sympathetic to the despairing blacks who rioted, and he understood their reasons. As he said, rioting is the language of the unheard. He also realized that palliative measures were not enough, and that the roots of black discontent lay in the appalling poverty in which they existed. Lived is too fine a word. This must somehow be corrected. At the same time, he felt that the burning and killing and looting terrified people, black as well as white, and intensified white backlash without accomplishing any but the most token reforms. Many whites felt guilty about the deprivations of the Negroes, and these outbreaks eased their consciences and gave them an excuse to say, if the Negroes are going to behave in this irresponsible way, they don't deserve the rights they are demanding. Rioting gave the white establishment an easy way out. Martin had always tried to channel the frustrations and anger of oppressed people into constructive courses, into massive, nonviolent, though militant demonstrations. He had a wonderful power of persuasion and could often talk even the most bitter proponents of violence out of their radical intentions. Many of them became his unarmed bodyguards. Others suppressed violent tendencies in the ranks, and more than a few converted so completely to nonviolence that they joined the staff of SCLC. Martin did not have a one-dimensional, negative view of black nationalism. He saw it partially as black self-respect trying to surface. He realized that it was not necessarily anti-white, but that it is extremely difficult to be proudly black and to feel equal in so repressive a white society. Above all, he kept in mind that the whites who reproached militants in self-righteous indignation conveniently forgot that the evil was caused by white racism in the first place. Yet Martin would not compromise with hate or violence, and the careful balance he maintained earned him respect from both whites and blacks who could not yet understand each other. In February, there appeared a small but troublesome cloud on the horizon. In Memphis, Tennessee, the Sanitation Workers Union, most of whose members were black, had gone on strike because of the unjust treatment they were receiving from the newly elected mayor, Henry Loeb. On February 23rd, a small peaceful demonstration march by the union had been brutally broken up by police using clubs and mace, with squad cars as a sort of cavalry. This action outraged not only black people in Memphis, but many whites as well. What had been a small strike by an obscure local union became a citywide protest movement in which SCLC's local affiliate, headed by Jim Lawson, took a leading part. Predominantly white AFL-CIO unions joined in. Jim telephoned Martin for help. Martin went to Memphis to address a huge mass meeting, and while he was there, Lawson asked him to lead a protest march in Memphis on March 28th. The march had already started when Martin got there, so he rushed by automobile to the head of the line. He soon realized that the march was not well disciplined. There was never even a proper line formed. Black power placards were being held by some marchers, and there were other things about the demonstration that Martin did not know. For example, some of the younger black nationalists had threatened to break up the march if they were not given recognition. This had been a problem throughout the Memphis strike, but no one had told my husband about it. He had gone no more than a few blocks when he heard crashing glass and the sounds of rocks and bottles being thrown from the back of the line. It has been generally agreed that the trouble had not been started by the marchers, but by gangs of young men who, using the parade as a cover, hurled rocks through windows and dodged in and out of the ranks to lose their identity among them. It turned into a horrible situation. Mayor Loeb had brought the tension about in the first place by refusing even to discuss grievances. Now his police were ready and brutally moved in on the marchers. Loeb also sent for the National Guard. Many people were beaten up, and one young man was shot in the back and killed. When he got home, Martin told me that he felt that after the violence started, the police were completely unrestrained. This was the first time violence had ever broken out in a march he was leading. Although he knew that he was not responsible, he felt terrible about what had happened. Martin came home Sunday evening. He was to go to Memphis Wednesday morning on a 7 o'clock flight. Ralph Abernathy came by the house to pick up Martin. Neither Ralph nor Martin ate anything. They even refused coffee and juice. I followed Martin to the door, kissed him goodbye, and wished him well. The children were still asleep, and they did not see him off. It was an ordinary goodbye like thousands of other times before. Millions and millions of people for days and days, as the tape was run and rerun, watched Martin speak at the meeting that night. Yet he almost had not gone because a violent rainstorm came up, and Ralph Abernathy had felt that not many people would come. Martin needed rest, and Ralph volunteered to go and speak for him. However, when Ralph got to Claiborne Temple, he found that about 2,000 people had turned out in spite of the weather. They applauded him politely, but he knew they were disappointed. Ralph left the platform and telephoned Martin, urging him to come to address the waiting crowd. Martin put on his raincoat and went directly to the meeting. Ralph said, "I knew this was not my crowd. They wanted to hear Martin." As always, no matter how Martin had felt beforehand, the enthusiasm of the people inspired him. That night, completely spontaneously, he gave one of his greatest speeches. First, he told the citizens of Memphis that he was heart and soul with them, that their cause was just, and that he and his organization would fight for them. He said that even if the federal injunction was not lifted, he would lead the march on Monday. He had the audience roaring with excitement, and he responded in kind. Then the mantle of prophecy seemed to descend upon Martin. He told the people that his plane from Atlanta had been delayed that morning because Dr. Martin Luther King is aboard, and there was a search for a possible bomb. He told of how when he got to Memphis, there were threats and rumors of an attack on him. Then Martin said, "I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter to me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I won't mind. Like anybody, I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." So intense was the audience's emotional response to Martin's words, so high was his own exaltation responding to their excitement, the action and reaction of one to the other, that he was overcome. He broke off there. I believe he intended to finish the quotation, "His truth is marching on," but he could not. The next afternoon, Thursday, April 4th, I went shopping with Yolanda. I had not been home very long when the telephone rang. It was Jesse Jackson. He said, "Coretta, Doc just got shot. I would advise you to take the next thing smoking." It hit me hard, not surprise, but shock, that the call I seemed subconsciously to have been waiting for all our lives had come. I asked for details, and Jesse, trying to spare me, said he was shot in the shoulder. I sensed it was quite serious, and I wanted to ask how seriously hurt he was, but I was afraid. I said, "I'll check the next flight." "They've taken him to St. Joseph's Hospital," said Jesse. "Why don't you come to the hotel and then we'll get you to the hospital?" Somehow I felt it might have been fatal, and I called Dora MacDonald and asked her to come over. Then Andy Young called from Memphis and told me Martin's condition was very serious. "He's not dead," Andy said. It was about 7:20 then, and I told him I'd be on the 8:25 flight. Andy said, "All right, we'll be looking for you." "He was shot in the neck. Bring someone with you." "Dora's on her way over," I answered. "Bring Dora," Andy said. "Maybe Juanita Abernathy can come. I'll call her," I added. I turned on the television. They were talking about Martin, reporting what I already knew. By that time, the children had come into the room, and although I tried to turn the TV down, they had already heard enough to know that something had happened to their father. They asked, "What is it?" Yoki said, don't tell me," and ran crying from the room. But she soon came back. I said to her, "I'm getting ready to go to Memphis because your daddy has been shot." All the children were in the room, and Yolanda started to help me pack. It was the first time she had ever offered to do so. Then the telephone rang again. The voice said, "Mrs. King, this is Mayor Allen. I called to ask if there's any help I can give." I said, "Well, I'm leaving for Memphis on the 8:25 flight." Mayor Allen said, "I'm coming over myself, and I'll try to get there before you leave. I'll send an officer over to go with you." While I was getting ready, friends from all over town began coming in. Then Mayor Allen came with his wife. Dora MacDonald had come and then gone home to get her things and meet me at the airport. It was now 8 o'clock. As I started to leave, Dexter asked me, "Mommy, when will you be back?" I said, "Dexter, I'll call you from Memphis and let you know when I'll be back." "Mommy, when will Daddy be back?" "Dexter, I'll call you from Memphis and let you know." Then, of course, I kissed all the children goodbye. Christine and her husband Isaac came with me to the airport, with the mayor and Mrs. Allen, and Reverend Fred Bennett and his wife Benita. As we walked up the long corridor full of hurrying people, it all seemed unreal, nightmarish. Mayor Allen said to me, "It's such a senseless thing. When will people ever learn?" Then I heard my name echoing over the public address system. "Someone is paging me," I said. And I had a strange, cold feeling, for I knew it was the word from Memphis, and that the word was bad. By this time, we had reached the gate to board the plane. I asked the mayor to have someone check the page for me. A few minutes later, I saw Dora MacDonald walking toward me very fast, and I noticed the expression on her face as she came running up. She said, "Come on, we need a room where we can sit down." Then I knew Martin was dead. I knew Martin did not want any fanfare or extravagant tributes. The main thing he was concerned about was that his funeral be in keeping with the kind of life he had led and the principles he had lived by. I don't think he would have been concerned that a large number of people attended. I told the press that Martin would have wanted SCLC to continue under the leadership of Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, and others. I thanked all of our friends at SCLC, at Ebenezer, and throughout the world who had rallied to help at this painful time. Then I talked about Martin and said, "My husband often told the children that if a man had nothing that was worth dying for, then he was not fit to live. He said also that it's not how long you live, but how well you live. He knew that at any moment his physical life could be cut short, and we faced this possibility squarely and honestly. My husband faced the possibility of death without bitterness or hatred. He knew that this was a sick society totally infested with racism and violence that questioned his integrity, maligned his motives, and distorted his views, which would ultimately lead to his death, and he struggled with every ounce of his energy to save that society from itself. He never hated. He never despaired of well-doing, and he encouraged us to do likewise, and so he prepared us constantly for the tragedy. I am surprised and pleased at the success of his teaching, for our children say calmly, 'Daddy is not dead. He may be physically dead, but his spirit will never die.' Ours has been a religious home, and this too has made this burden easier to bear. Our concern now is that his work does not die. He gave his life for the poor of the world, the garbage workers of Memphis, and the peasants of Vietnam. Nothing hurt him more than that man could attempt no way to solve problems except through violence. He gave his life in search of a more excellent way, a more effective way, a creative rather than a destructive way. We intend to go on in search of that way, and I hope that you who loved and admired him would join us in fulfilling his dream. The day that Negro people and others in bondage are truly free, on the day want is abolished, on the day wars are no more, on that day I know my husband will rest in a long-deserved peace." Saturday morning, Harry Belafonte said to me, "I want to talk to you about something that has been on my mind. You don't have to agree, but think about it. I think you should go to Memphis and march on Monday if it isn't too much for you. It would mean a great deal to people throughout the nation for you just to be there." Immediately I replied, "I agree. I think Martin would have wanted me to go. I had not thought about it before, but now that you raise the question, I would really like to go. I may even take the children." So on Monday, I flew to Memphis with Harry Belafonte, Justine Smadback, and my 3 oldest children in a plane Harry provided. There was no difficulty in Memphis. In the shock and sorrow of Martin's death, the federal injunction against the march was either forgotten or rescinded. There was hardly a person in America who would have dared or even wanted to enforce it. We were rushed from the airport to the head of the line, and we marched about a mile to City Hall. Ralph Abernathy and the children walking beside me. There were 25,000, perhaps 50,000 people marching, some of whom had come to Memphis from all parts of the country for this demonstration. There were dense crowds of people along the route who did not cheer or wave, but stood silent in Martin's memory. Even my children seemed to sense the sympathy and compassion those people felt for us. Of course, the children sat on the platform with me at City Hall. When it came my turn to speak, Harry Belafonte introduced me. I talked about Martin's qualities as a leader and as a husband and a father. I talked about his work, his great hope for social and economic justice for all. I explained Martin's concept of redemptive suffering and that he had been prepared to give his life to the cause in which he believed. However, in closing, I ask a question. How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society? How long will it take? If we can catch the spirit and the true meaning of this experience, I believe this nation can be transformed into a society of love, of justice, peace, and brotherhood, where all men can really be brothers. When I finished, I received an accolade from my daughter. Yolanda said, "Mommy, you were real good." That experience in Memphis and the inspiration I derived from it helped me to get through those first days and also the long days ahead. I was so uplifted by the spirit of the people, the inspiration I gained from them. I hope I gave back to them by being there. You see, I feel strongly that Martin's work must go on. In the same way that I had given him all the support I could during his lifetime, I was even more determined to do so now that he was no longer with us. I felt that I must rededicate myself to the completion of his work. Also, I felt that not only must I do this, but that if enough individuals joined in the work, Martin's dream would be realized, and his death will have served the redemptive purpose which he talked about so often. Not that I can do what Martin did, but I hope to make my contribution in my own way. In some small way, perhaps I can serve, as he did, the aspirations of oppressed people of all races throughout the world.